The final years of Muhammad's life are often painted as a time of triumph, a prophet cementing his place in history. But behind the victories and the sermons was a darker reality, a consolidation of power built not on peace, but on force. Armies marched, opponents vanished, and those who dared to dissent found themselves silenced. What was called unity came at the cost of blood. As Muhammad's influence spread across Arabia, so too did his reliance on coercion. Tribes were faced with impossible choices: embrace his authority or face destruction. Cities fell, one after another, their autonomy erased under the weight of allegiance sworn at sword's edge. This was not a gentle invitation to faith. It was submission demanded. Under the shadow of violence, those who resisted, poets, leaders, and entire tribes, were branded as threats. Their words, their defiance, their very existence challenged the emerging empire. One by one, they were eliminated. Some assassinated in the dark of night, others slaughtered in broad daylight, and entire communities cast out into exile. These were not mere political measures. They were acts of suppression, and the human cost was staggering. By the time his power was absolute, Muhammad had created more than a faith. He had created a system where questioning was deadly. Loyalty was enforced, obedience demanded, and dissent answered with the sword. The legacy left behind was not only one of spiritual teaching, but of political control secured through bloodshed. The conquest of Mecca is often hailed as a bloodless victory, a moment of mercy, but peel back the layers and the story darkens. The city surrendered, not out of faith, but out of fear. Its leaders knew resistance meant annihilation. Those branded as enemies were marked for execution. Some escaped only by clinging to the Kaaba, begging for their lives. It was not peace. It was submission under the threat of death. Once inside Mecca, the old ways were wiped away. Idols were smashed, traditions erased, and an ancient culture was dismantled overnight. What had once been a diverse spiritual landscape was reduced to a single imposed truth. Families who had lived for generations by their own faiths were now forced to abandon them or be branded enemies of God. Even after Mecca's fall, the sword did not rest. Campaigns against tribes who refused allegiance swept across Arabia. Some were massacred, others enslaved, and still others stripped of their lands and driven into exile. To the victors, these were triumphs. But to the victims, it was devastation. Their homes burned, their children taken, their voices silenced. In these final years, religion became inseparable from politics. Faith was no longer a choice. It was a weapon wielded to demand loyalty. Those who resisted were not only rebels, but heretics, enemies of God himself. By framing dissent as blasphemy, every act of resistance could be crushed with divine justification. It was power wrapped in sanctity, leaving no room for freedom. As Muhammad's power expanded, so too did the fear that held Arabia in its grip. Tribes swore allegiance not out of conviction, but because refusal meant destruction. The message was clear. Loyalty brought survival. Defiance brought ruin. This was not unity through faith, but submission through fear. Poets, leaders, and dissenters, anyone who dared to question the growing empire, faced swift punishment. Some were assassinated in the dead of night, others executed publicly as examples. The sword did not silence just armies. It silenced ideas, turning Arabia into a land where questioning the ruler was questioning God. As illness overtook Muhammad, his community was left anxious and divided. Who would lead after him? The man who had risen from outcast to absolute ruler had not left a clear path. Whispers spread. Was his power built on divine truth, or on the blood of those forced into silence? In his final days, the empire was secure, but it was also fragile, built on conquest, not consent. When Muhammad died in 632, his followers wasted no time. The wars of expansion began almost immediately. The same methods: fear, conquest, and forced allegiance spread beyond Arabia. What had been justified in the name of survival became a model for empire. The message endured. Power could be taken, held, and expanded by the sword, so long as it was wrapped in the cloak of religion. Muhammad's passing should have brought peace, the closing of an era, but instead, it unleashed chaos. Tribes that had been coerced into allegiance saw his death as freedom. They rejected the heavy hand of Medina, believing their forced submission had ended with the man who demanded it. For a moment, Arabia breathed with the hope of independence. But the new leaders of Islam saw defiance as betrayal. What began as voices of autonomy were branded as apostasy, a crime punishable by death. Armies were dispatched across Arabia, not to spread faith, but to crush dissent. Villages were torched, chiefs executed, and countless men and women slaughtered. These were not wars of faith. They were wars to chain a fractured people back into obedience. For tribes who resisted, the punishment was swift and merciless. Some were massacred outright, their blood soaking into the desert sands. Others were enslaved, their lives reduced to spoils of war. The lesson was burned into Arabia's memory. Once you swore allegiance, you could never walk away. Freedom of belief was not an option, only obedience or death. By the time the Ridda Wars ended, Arabia was subdued, not by persuasion, not by faith, but by fire, blood, and fear. The legacy of Muhammad's final years was sealed. A political machine built on conquest, its foundation cemented with corpses. What began as a call to worship had become an empire, and its survival depended on violence. The final years of Muhammad's life, and the years that followed, were not the story of peace, but of power enforced by violence. Entire tribes silenced, their homes burned, their voices erased. What history calls consolidation, the victims knew as massacre. The Ridda Wars were not about faith. They were about control, a message carved into flesh and fire. Once you submit, you can never leave. This was not glory. This was fear dressed in sanctity. And as we look back, one truth becomes undeniable. The blood was real. The screams were real. And the victims deserve remembrance, not silence. For history must record them, not as traitors, but as people who dared to seek freedom.